This program is the history of Edgewater Steel. The Edgewater Steel Company was an important part of Oakmont for 85 years. Edgewater manufactured train wheels and rings. Edgewater wheels were known throughout the world for their superior quality. The rings forged at Edgewater served the rail, aviation, and aerospace industries. Today, the mill is but a memory of an era of past industrial might that has vanished from our country. The story of Edgewater Steel is not just the story of a factory, but the story of a way of life.
And the sons of foremen porters, and the sons of engineers, ride their father's magic carpet made of steel.
The name Edgewater actually predates the steel factory and the town of Oakmont by a number of years. In 1853, a gentleman by the name of John Crossan purchased a tract of land 10 miles upriver from Pittsburgh. He built a large house and he named his estate Edgewater. Now, John Crossan was the owner of the Monongahela House Hotel in Pittsburgh. And if you've studied history, you've probably heard of the Monongahela House. It was the hotel in Pittsburgh. Anybody of any importance who came to the city during the latter half of the 1800s, even up into the early 1900s, stayed at the Monongahela House. Abraham Lincoln stayed there on his way to his inauguration. Charles Dickens stayed there when he toured America. And the Prince of Wales, who later became the King of England, stayed there whenever he came through America. John Crossan actually invited Charles Dickens and the Prince of Wales out to Edgewater. You've probably read that they visited Oakmont. Well, they were here, but it was before the borough was founded. The other interesting thing is Mr. Crossan was active in the Underground Railroad. The Monongahela House was a stop along the Underground Railroad, and a number of slaves who were escaping came through Pittsburgh, and they actually came into the hotel, and he disguised them as employees at the hotel. Some historians claim that his Edgewater estate was actually a stop on the Underground Railroad. Now, this picture is a picture of his estate at Edgewater, and this would have been painted from across the river over near Blawnox, if you're familiar with that area, looking up the river. You can see the hills, which is where the expressway comes along there, the bend in the river, and you see his estate, and then a large barn behind there. And this is the earliest image we have of Oakmont. This was painted in 1860 by an artist by the name of William Wall. William Wall did a lot of landscape pictures in western Pennsylvania, and it just so happened he did Crossan's house. This is another shot. This picture was taken probably around 1900 from the same spot as that picture was painted, across the river, looking up the river. And if you look over to the side there, you can see the Crossan estate, his house. Just gives you another shot taken at a later date. Mr. Crossan was so important that when the railroad came through in 1853, he had his own railroad station. It was called the Edgewater Station. This was located at the corner of Allegheny Avenue and College Avenue. And if you look in the back, you see the little gatehouse there. That's the house that was just torn down, probably I think in 2007 or 2008. So that house was actually one of the oldest structures in Oakmont from the estate and was actually incorporated into the factory. In 1910, a gentleman by the name of George Best purchased the Edgewater estate, and he built a factory. His factory was Best Manufacturing, and he made hydraulic valves and piping products. Best Manufacturing made a lot of the underground water pipes for the city of New York whenever they were putting in their water lines. They came out of Best Manufacturing. As you can see, under the water tower, that's the same water tower that we all remember, and this building here is the old Crossan estate. It was actually moved up from the river and converted into an office building. Unfortunately, the company got into financial trouble and they filed for bankruptcy in 1914. If you're familiar with the Elks Club on Washington Avenue, that was actually George Best's house. That's where he lived. He built that house. And then later the Elks acquired it. Frank Bell was the founder of Edgewater Steel Company. He was born in Mercer County, PA, and he graduated from Lehigh University in 1897 with a degree in mechanical engineering. After he graduated from college, he had a job designing rail cars for the Standard Steel Rail Company here in Pittsburgh. From that job, he went to work at the open hearth at the Clairton Steel Works. He was actually the superintendent of the open hearth in Clairton. From Clairton, he went out to Chicago, and he took a job with the Interocean Steel Company. And while he was there, he designed and built train wheels and train rings. While he was working there, he came up with a process to roll wheels, and he had it patented. And after he obtained his patent, he left Interocean Steel, and he came back to Pittsburgh, and he purchased the old Best Manufacturing Factory, and he started his own factory. And because of the history of the area, Edgewater Station, the Edgewater Estate, he decided to name his new factory the Edgewater Steel Company. His company was formally incorporated on October 4th, 1916. As soon as he took over the Best Manufacturing and started remodeling, the government came calling. Because you see, the United States had entered World War I, and they were in need of war material. So they asked if Edgewater could manufacture guns for the war. So Edgewater began building 155 and 240 millimeter howitzer guns. And this is one of the howitzers. Now, I don't know if this was made at Edgewater, but these were the type of guns that were made at Edgewater. Do we have any Edgewater employees here? I think there's a building that was always referred to as the gun house. Gun shop, yeah. That's why, because they made the guns there. So during the war, he made these guns, but also while he was making the guns, he continued to revamp and remodel to get ready to make his train wheels. The armistice was signed on November 11th, 1918, as we all know. And one month later, the first Edgewater wheel rolled off the line. Now, in the early days, when they started out, Edgewater was a very insignificant player in the steel business. Their competitors were U.S. Steel, Standard Steel Company, the American Locomotive Works, and the Baldwin Locomotive Works. Huge companies. And then you had little Edgewater. And they decided they were going to get into the train wheel manufacturing business. I found memoirs of Frank Bell. And in his memoirs, he talked about the early board meetings. And they would have meetings of the directors. And nothing was written down for those board meetings. Each board member was given a different topic to discuss. And at the end of the meeting, all those notes were collected and destroyed. Because if one of their competitors had found out how precarious their financial situation was, all U.S. Steel would have had to do was take a price decline on a train wheel of maybe 3 cents, and Edgewater would be out of business. So as a result, they didn't keep any records officially. And the times were different. The government didn't require the records as they do now. So in those early days, they kept no records. It was all verbal as to how the company was doing, how their profits and things like that were. But they hung in there, and they became a major player in this train wheel business. And this is an early picture of the factory not long after they opened. But the process at Edgewater was the only one capable of pressing wheels on a press smaller than 8,000 tons. And his process also eliminated a need for reheat while forming. And as a result, his wheels were much stronger than any other cast wheels that were out there at the time. So Edgewater wheels were safer, and they were lasted longer than the competitors. By 1924, they had established themselves, And they had gained the reputation of producing high-quality, strong train wheels and rings. And soon afterwards, Edgewater set the standard for train wheels. In 1930, Frank Bell traveled to England, and he entered into an agreement with the Taylor Steel Company of England. And he set up a factory over there for Taylor, and they produced Edgewater wheels in England, and they were shipped all over Europe. After that, the Taylor-Edgewater partnership built mills in Russia, Australia, and Osaka, Japan. So you had Edgewater wheels all over the world. In 1925, Edgewater developed what they called the ring spring. And the ring spring is a cylindrical shock absorber. And it's made with steel rings, very small steel rings. Edgewater, the reason they came up with these is they had a problem with the old trains, the couplers. Whenever a train would start out, you would get the pressure between the cars as it went, and also when it slowed down, you would have those couplers banging up against each other. So Edgewater developed a coupler with the ring springs that could absorb that shock when those cars started and stopped. And that's what they developed the ring springs for. However, afterwards, Frank Bell actually patented a landing gear for an aircraft. And this is actually the patent application. This is a drawing from the patent application of his ring spring shock absorber, which is used on airplanes. And the other interesting thing is Buick automobiles. They were the first automobile to develop independent four-wheel suspensions in their car. And they did that jointly with Edgewater. Edgewater helped them develop those suspensions for their cars using the Edgewater ring spring. So throughout the 30s, Edgewater dealt with the Depression. Business was up and down, just like every other company did. But they were still profitable because rail travel was so important back then. That was before the highway system, before we had all the cars that we have today. So rail was the main mode of transportation. And they were able to be a profitable company throughout the 30s. However, as we all know, in 1941, the United States became involved in World War II, and Edgewater contributed to the war effort. Not long after the war was declared, Frank Bell actually stepped down as president of Edgewater, and he went to Washington, D.C., and he was appointed Chief of Army Ordnance for the Pittsburgh District. And what his job was, if the armies, navies, Air Corps, they needed any type of material, supplies, it was Frank Bell who would get it for them. If they needed parts for tanks, he would find the company to manufacture it. He was actually responsible for $650 million in Army contracts here in Pittsburgh, southwestern Pennsylvania area. So he had a very important job because at the time, we all know Pittsburgh was a huge industrial center, and he was responsible for procuring that stuff for the Army. When he stepped down, his son David Bell took over the reins of the company, and he ran the company while his father was gone. So Edgewater wheels kept the trains running during World War II. The other thing that they used, they had their ring springs. They actually used those as they were adapted to be used in machine guns. And they were recoil mechanisms in machine guns. So almost all of the machine guns that were used by the Army in World War II had Edgewater adapters in them. They were manufactured here, very important. They also had the landing gear for the airplanes, so a lot of the airplanes in the war used Edgewater adapters. And the large rings that were produced in Edgewater were used as tank turrets, so they were a huge producer for Army goods. Well, what's interesting is when Germany invaded Russia, when Hitler attacked Russia, one of the first factories they destroyed was the train wheel factory in Russia, because they knew how important train wheels were to the war effort. So Frank Bell's factory was destroyed by the Germans. The other thing was, they had also built, as I said, they built a plant in Osaka, Japan. But when the Allies began their bombing campaign of Japan, they actually contacted Frank Bell and asked him for the blueprints for the factory. he gave them the blueprints, and he went and met with them and told them, if you're going to bomb, this is the part of the factory you have to be sure to hit to make sure that it's disabled for good. If you don't hit this, they can rebuild it. So he helped design that, and then he helped destroy it whenever the war came out. War material was not the only contribution to the war effort during World War II. At the time, their workforce numbered roughly 1,100 men. Out of that 1,100 men, 497 went off to fight in the war. So you could say between 40 and 45% of the men in the mill left the mill and went to work, went to war. So as a result, they had a labor shortage, and they hired women. And women came in and worked as crane operators, inspectors, office personnel, just stepped right into the jobs. I heard the story of one of the teachers here at Oakmont, who happened to be my kindergarten teacher, and they said during the war, she was actually a guard at Edgewater. And she would patrol around the grounds with a rifle slung over her shoulder, patrolling the grounds. And there was a genuine fear that there would be sabotage. So they had armed guards patrolling the factory at the beginning of the war. Then as it started, the tide started to change. They did away with the guards there. But the women came in and did a nice job filling in for the men. But what's interesting, when the war was over, they all left. They went home. They resigned their jobs, gave them back to the men who returned. While they were there, they did other things to help the war effort. Throughout the war, the employees of Edgewater raised $47,000 for war bonds, just between the people who worked in the factory. They held blood drives for the wounded soldiers. They sold candy and soda in the factory to raise money for the soldiers. And what they would do, every couple of months, they would put together gift boxes for any Edgewater employee who was fighting in the war. And they would send it off. And they would put things in like a comb, a picture frame, maybe tablet, pencils. And they would also enclose a copy of the Edgewater newsletter. This Edgewater newsletter was published each month, and it had news of the mill. And they would send these boxes anywhere there were men fighting from Edgewater, whether it be the South Pacific, Europe, Alaska, anywhere. They would get a gift box with the ESCO news. And I think it's funny because this little newsletter probably had a wider circulation than any of the big dailies in Pittsburgh. You know, it was going all over the world. The men always looked forward to their Edgewater newsletter. And what they would do is they would write letters not only home, but they would write letters to their friends in the steel mill. And then they would publish the letters in the Edgewater newsletter. And I just had a couple of examples of the kind of letters that came back. And this would have been from 1945, near the end of the war. But this letter said, "Dear editor and mill gang, just received my first copy of ESCO News. It's sure a swell paper, and it really cheers up a Joe to read about the old gang back home. I've read it a couple of times, and I've really enjoyed it. I wish to thank all responsible for your kindness. It's nice to know the old friends back home haven't forgotten you. I know Edgewater is doing its share for the cause. They always have. I know we have plenty of shells, because right now there are a lot going on, flying over my head. Thanks again. We'll be looking for more copies of the ESCO News. One of the old gang, Armand Bruno." And then another letter that came in. "Dear employees, I received Edgewater's Yuletide greeting with $2 enclosed." Evidently they sent him $2 in spending money. "It's hard to express in words how touched I am to know that my fellow workers still remember me. On this side of the ocean where you live from day to day, it certainly makes a person feel good to know that many back home look forward to the day we return. Again, I express my thanks for ESCO News. Reading on one of the editions is almost like being in the plant again. Thank you all for what you do and for what you stand for. I remain your fellow employee, Frank Costa." So this letter, they would publish these letters back and forth, and it's really amazing. We have a couple of the old newsletters in our files, and just to read where some of these men were and what they were going through during World War II. And that was always the back page. Throughout the war, they would always publish pictures of the men who were fighting. You may know some of these men up here. I don't know if you can see that up there. But they would publish, print their pictures in the newsletter. Sorry, April 10th, 1944, Edgewater hit a milestone. The 1 millionth wheel was rolled. And this is a picture of the gang who were there that day. I have to tell you, my grandfather worked at Edgewater, and my grandmother, anytime we had any pictures, she would always write on the back who was there, where they were, what they were doing. We always made fun of her. But on the back of that picture, she wrote every single person's name on there. So now we know everybody that's in that picture. The war was over. And this is another ad that they ran for Edgewater. Wheels welcome them home. Going home, going home, going home. And this is another train that, picture of another passenger train using the Edgewater wheels. Well, the war was over, so they refocused their attention. By the late 1940s, they had 14 regional sales offices across the country. They expanded into new technologies. The Oakmont plant included 3 gas wells, 3 water wells, 5 miles of train track. It's hard to believe in that area there were actually 5 miles of train track around the factory. They had 2 engines, 28 freight cars, 1 crane car, and 2 dump cars. And in 1957, work began on plant number 2. In 1958, a fire destroyed the office. And March 10th, 1958. And again, the office building was still the old Crossan estate. I told you that Mr. Best had moved it up and converted it into an office. Well, when Frank Bell bought it, he continued to use it as an office building. Through the years, it had been remodeled, expanded. There were a lot of new walls put in, lowered ceilings, so there had been a lot of changes. On that day, it was a Saturday, a fire started in the basement. The basement was used to store files, so there were a lot of paper files down there. The fire got up into the walls and up into the ceilings. And the firemen fought it for 24 hours. The problem was they couldn't get to the flames because it was burning inside the building. So it was hard for them to actually put down the flames. They said when they finally did get it under control, the basement was filled with water. That's how much water they poured onto the fire. They said the heat was so intense that it cracked the brick walls. It was almost like an oven, the way it was just blazing in there. Well, I guess the statute of limitations is expired. See, my grandfather was a pipe fitter, and also known as a plumber. And on that Saturday, he just so happened to be in the basement soldering some pipes. And never got the full story, but that's about all the story I got. So, I don't know, Grandpap, that may have been... After that building had burnt down, then they built the new brick building out in the corner. I'm sure you all remember the Edgewater office building that stood out there. Edgewater, after the war, they started to branch out, as I said, and they partnered with Alcoa to develop lightweight aluminum train wheels. And these were used on those new transit systems, that Bay Area Rapid Transit in San Francisco, the Chicago Rapid Transit system were all run on Edgewater wheels. Another one that was interesting, by the late 40s, you started to see diesel locomotives come into the rails. They replaced the steam engines. Well, the Union Pacific had one last go at a steam engine, and this was called the Big Boy. And this was the largest locomotive ever produced. It was so big that it was hinged in the middle to get around curves. That's how big this thing was. They said it was almost as long as a city block, but it ran on Edgewater wheels. They made heavy wheels like that. They also made the wheels for Walt Disney for his trains at Disney World. The Disneyland train ran on Edgewater wheels. In 1947, the Illinois Central Railroad introduced an express train that ran from Chicago to New Orleans, and they named it the City of New Orleans. I'm sure you all know the song, City of New Orleans. In 1972, Arlo Guthrie had a hit with that song. That train ran on Edgewater train wheels. So the next time you hear that song on the radio, you can say, that ran on Edgewater train wheels. The one interesting thing, in the song he says, I'll be gone 500 miles before the day is done, but the train actually ran 921 miles in one day. And they did it on Edgewater wheels.
Good morning, America, how are you? Say, don't you know me? I'm your native son. I'm the train they call the City of New Orleans. I'll be gone 500 miles when the day is done.
Edgewater manufactured the roller wheels for the dome on the Civic Arena. Edgewater teamed up with Pratt & Whitney for their rings in jet engines. And Edgewater rings were used on the Saturn V rocket that propelled the astronauts of Apollo 11 to the moon. And we did this before. We had somebody say their brother was actually worked on this project for NASA. And when he saw the ring come in, he saw the little circle E Edgewater on it, and he said, I know where Oakmont is, my sister lives there. So everybody knew that that's where they came from. Edgewater was a small company compared to the giants of the industry. However, they competed head-to-head with those giants. Their competitors were the U.S. Steel, Standard Steels, Pullman Standard. But those large companies tried, but they were never able to match the quality of an Edgewater wheel. And for over 80 years, Edgewater Steel set the mark for quality train wheels. This is a newer picture here. You can see the office building is the front. Plant number 2 over here is built on the side, plant number 1. And the gun shop, is that the one that says Edgewater on the front? I think that's the gun shop there. Aside from all that was produced at Edgewater, I think one of the most important things is the people of Edgewater. When I wrote the book on Edgewater, I talked to a number of people, and no one had a single bad thing to say about the Bell family. Frank Bell, David Bell, they treated their employees very fairly. When we study labor industry, labor history, we all often hear the stories of the clashes between union and management. But at Edgewater, there never seemed to be any of that. Because the Bells were a small company, they took a genuine interest in their employees. In the early days, before the second plant came in, they actually cleared a portion of the ground for a recreation area for their employees. They cleared a section of the riverbank and made a beach where they could come down and swim on the weekends. Mr. Bell built company houses next to the factory for his employees. Those are those houses on 2nd, 3rd, and Beach Street. Those are all the Edgewater houses. What he did was, in the early days, he gave first preference to the millwrights, the plumbers, the electricians, the maintenance men, because if something should break down on the weekend or the evening, this is in the days before everybody had cars, all he would have to do is call across the street and they could walk right over to the plant. So they had first preference at those houses, but then they opened them up to other people. Bell put a baseball field on the property, and he sponsored an Edgewater baseball team. He had bowling leagues, not only for his employees, but for his wives. Each summer, he sponsored company picnics out at Idlewild Park. And in the early days, he would charter a train, and the train would come to Edgewater. Everyone boarded at Edgewater, and the train would take everybody out to Idlewild Park. Each Christmas, he would have a Christmas party up at the high school, Gilmore School, for the children of the employees. The one thing that I thought was really interesting, he built a 3-hole golf course on the company grounds. and the golf course was open to any employee. And each summer they would hold a tournament, and they would give out trophies and everything. They said the first hole had a slag pile hazard on the left side. It was the only course that had a slag pile hazard. And they said if you hit that, you never knew which way your ball would go. It could come back at you, to the left, to the right, up in the air, but that was the hazard. And they had a name for they named it. You probably all heard of Longview Golf Course. Well, they named this Shortview Golf Course because it was only 3 holes. Edgewater also started a pension plan in 1941, and he was one of the first companies to do that. He also sponsored what he called an educational forum. And each month, he would invite speakers to come in and talk about technology in the steel industry, current events, and those were open to all the employees that wanted to come. He offered a company bonus. He started a credit union. And during the Depression, when people were having a tough time of it, he took a portion of the property and made gardens. And he gave the employees seed and fertilizer and let them grow vegetables to help feed their families. The other thing I thought was interesting, there were times whenever they had to have layoffs during the Depression. But what he would do is, he didn't do it by seniority. He did it by family size. If you were a young single guy and they had to lay off, you would be the first to go. If you had 3 kids, it might be a little longer. If you had 8, 10 kids, you got to stay. So he did that to try to help the families out. Frank David Bell's grandson shared his great-grandfather's memoirs with me, so I was able to read those, and I really got a lot of good information out there. But Frank Bell said that he wrote, "A company develops a personality, which is the summation of the personalities of the people within it." And I think anybody associated with Edgewater could certainly say Edgewater had a personality. The people that worked there, it was noisy, it was hot in the summer, cold in the winter, but people seemed to have fond memories of the place. It really seemed like it was a good place to work and earn a living. The personalities made the company. And while I was doing research, I found some stories about some personalities, and I thought they were interesting, so I wanted to share a couple of those with you. There was a man by the name of Oscar Wickander, and he was a mechanical engineer that came to Edgewater from Sweden. And they said he loved to ice skate. And during the winter, whenever the river froze, back then it froze a lot more than it did now, on his lunch breaks, he would put on his skates and go down to the river and skate up and down the river because he liked to ice skate. There was a man by the name of John Henderson. And John Henderson was from Scotland. And he was a Presbyterian who loved to golf. But shortly after he came here, all the golf courses in the area, he joined Westmoreland Golf Course. Now, Westmoreland Golf Course was out in Rosedale, and it was a Jewish golf club. And the guys said they could never figure out why a Scottish Presbyterian would join a Jewish country club. So they asked him one day, and at the time there was a trolley that ran from Oakmont to Wilkinsburg. And they said, of all the country clubs, why'd you join that one? He said, oh, it's simple. He said, I get off work at 4 o'clock, I catch the 410 trolley right in front of Edgewater, I ride it to Rosedale, at 4:25, I get off the trolley, and at 4:40, I'm on the tee. Another story I thought was funny, there was an employee, I didn't get his name, but he happened to be in East Liberty late one night, and he was arrested. And it was on a case of mistaken identity. So back in the day, whenever you were arrested, they gave you a dime and said you got to make one phone call. So who did he call? David Bell. Now, I worked for General Mills. If I got arrested, the last person I would call would be the president of General Mills. But he called David Bell in the middle of the night and said, I'm in trouble. Well, in turn, David Bell called the Edgewater attorney and said, one of my guys is in trouble. I need you to help him. And he sent the attorney down to bail him out. Another guy that worked there, as you may know this guy too, Charlie Mihalik. Charlie played 7 years for the Pittsburgh Steelers. He played at Duquesne, he graduated, he was drafted in 1945 and played for the Steelers. In the off-season, he worked at Edgewater. And here he is keeping in shape, shelving into the open hearth. That's Charlie Mahaley. And from what I understand, you probably know his nephew, who also worked at Edgewater, Bill Fralick. Yeah, that's Bill Fralick's uncle. Well, by 1982, the Bell family had decided that they were no longer going to run Edgewater, and the factory was sold to the Hillman Corporation. And in his memoirs, Frank Bell wrote that he knew the day would come whenever the factory would no longer be viable. He knew it would be outdated. He knew high energy costs were making it inefficient, and the economy was changing. So the company was sold. And over the next 19 years, the company went through a number of owners and filed for bankruptcy 3 times. And finally, on September 21st, 2001, it closed its doors for good. Edgewater was a company that was small enough that everyone knew each other, but yet that little company produced goods that were known throughout the world. When we lost Edgewater, we lost not only a factory, but we lost a way of life. Thank you. Any questions?
Good night, America, how are you? Said, don't you know me? I'm your native son. I'm the train they call the city of New Orleans. I'll be gone 500 miles when the day is done.